that was wonderful. Thank you, Sandino, for such a lovely introduction. You're very much an activist yourself, and I really appreciate being here where, after watching Nina's TED Talk and the way that she introduced herself as an activist, not just sort of an executive, sort of here for a while and then gone, but actually here for the cause. And I love the approach to the cause, that this isn't just a place where art is treated as some sort of precious artifact you have to be antiseptic about, but that actually it could be alive and it could somehow have to do more with the living culture. And that's quite an issue because for many museums, there's sort of this almost literally a divorce between what they display and the living culture. Or certainly there's this distinction that's always drawn between what art is and what craft is. Craft being associated more with living community and culture building, and maybe fine art not necessarily feeling the need or recognizing the importance that creative expression can play in culture building or in reflecting back to a community what its vision is, which is, after all, its role over thousands and thousands of years until just more recently. Well, I'm going to be talking about public space tonight, and it's an issue that I'm very intimately familiar with and extremely passionate about. I want to start off just by showing a couple of outstanding examples in the world of public squares and how great they can be. On the upper left is Siena, the Piazza del Campo, which is famous, so famous that it seems like almost everyone ends up getting there at some point in their life. It's maybe the greatest public square in all the world, but they don't call it a square. It doesn't translate as square in their vocabulary because, after all, they don't live in squares. Like, we live in squares, so we call things public squares. We talk about getting out of the box and thinking out of the box because we live in them. I mean, our landscape is largely generated as an expression of a kind of a product-oriented lifestyle, as opposed to something like this, which is referred to as geomorphic, which means that it comes out of the place. It's crafted by the people who came there and settled and then sort of adapted themselves to the geography, paid attention to the direction of the light and the wind, figuring out how to capture water. And so this thing ends up being a social facilitator. It ends up being an ecological expression. But the most important function of it and all public spaces, really, is its symbolic function. So that finally, I mean, for us as Americans, this is a huge issue. You know, for Portland, we were there for 150 years before we finally had a public square. And until that point, we didn't have a social commons, and we didn't have one place where time and space and life was not for sale. Somewhere where everyone could say, you know, no matter how much I have, I can belong there. So I'm quite certain that the most important function of public space is to be open, to be place, and for people to identify with it so strongly that even when they're not there, it affects them. We know that it affects people's dreams to have a public square or a piazza or a plaza. You know, piazza in Italian, plaza in Spanish, Platz in German, Place in France. Like, it's everywhere in all cultures, but for some reason in the USA, it can be controversial to put in a public gathering place. In fact, just to put in a bench, you'll hear Americans frequently saying things like, "My God, you're going to put in a bench? You fools, don't you realize someone will sit there?" Like, we're so acculturated to our own isolation and individuation that we're afraid, mortally, of the idea that other people could somehow linger around us. Don't apparently know our own history of this kind of puritanical attitude toward our own lives, that somehow we must be working all the time. We must just define ourselves by work. But you know, public space isn't, or public place really isn't just about pleasure. It's not just about sociability. It is fundamentally about identity, that we somehow will identify enough with each other so we won't run each other down in the streets or shoot each other, perhaps. You know, I mean, this is kind of an important issue for those of us in the USA, where our crime rates can be 10 times higher than other nations. And we have sociologists telling us that while we have the highest crime rates of all first world nations and sort of all categories across the board, we also have the lowest number of outdoor gathering places of all first world nations. So it is a big deal to create a public square, and not just a square, and not just a place, but one that actually works, that's stellar. It makes people proud. It makes them love their place and identify with each other. What we know is that when these things exist in the midst of where people live, they actually get outside and they interact. They move around. It actually affects public health statistics. People become mentally and physically healthier as a result of having such a place. And if they have to retrofit it like an American neighborhood, they actually are affected to the extent that they stop feeling so alone. They start relating to other people. They start being able to listen more and be able, less afraid to just speak to other people in a public setting. I mean, my own comfort in talking with you tonight is because of getting so much practice in public comments that it becomes a pleasure to share stories and not something that I'm mortally afraid of. But they do say about Americans that we're more afraid of public speaking than we are of death. That's not our nature. People are like, Americans, they're crazy. Americans, no thanks. I don't want to have them around because all they want to do is talk about money and the price of things. That's what you hear when you travel. But that's not normal. That's not natural to us. It's actually it's an expression of our isolation from each other, and so much more that we need to understand. Okay, so to talk about public space, why is it vital? Well, for one thing, every single freaking village in the world and every culture begins with a social nexus at its heart. The village heart is the place from which we come. I mean, as we were crossing the plains to come out of the west, we'd circle our wagon every night to recreate the public space, even though it was ephemeral and it was a place of safety and security, but it was the fire circle. We were blocking the wind with our wagons, just as buildings do it, in villages. It can just last for a night, and then you move on and recreate it. I mean, after all, human beings don't just live in settled conditions, they're also nomadic, and both forms are valid. But you shouldn't have to go to college to learn from some sage like Carl Abbott that a city is supposed to help you talk. A village, a town is supposed to help you be able to speak. But we Americans have to go to school to pay thousands of dollars to learn this retroactively because we are not born into it. It is our birthright, and we should just simply be raised in it. We shouldn't even have to talk about it. But what we do is we save thousands of dollars to fly elsewhere to go experience these things. And then when we come back, you might read in the paper somebody saying something like, it'll take a long time, long after you're dead, before we're finally a strong enough culture to have gathering places. Bunk. In the work that we've done all over the continent at this point, my favorite sort of most salient statement about this issue was when a conservative man came to one of the workshops that we did in Northwest Portland. And he said, I'm a tea partier, and I came here tonight to disrupt this thing. I was planning on stopping you all from talking, but now I know that I should say to my conservative friends, by God, what good is freedom of assembly without a place to assemble? So why I love this work is it's a common cause. It's literally about common ground. And without it, we remain susceptible to this perpetual polarity that is played upon by certain political parties who just, engender division. But what if we had some way of having context, be able to frame our lives so that we understood we have way more in common than we don't? Maybe it would make us a more resilient political culture. Maybe we would find many more ways to work together to accomplish things and solve problems in our lives. Well, lately, creating public spaces so we can come back together isn't the only issue in town. We have the greatest design constraint that we've ever faced in the world now, which is around climate change, to somehow reduce the distances that we travel, to somehow cohere local cultures, to somehow work together more locally so we don't have to drive vast distances. Here's something, Americans, all of us live in these neighborhoods that are absent gathering places. We don't even realize that we live in home zones. We have to travel vast distances to work zones. Because of the function of how our neighborhoods have been laid out, we must emit carbon just to go earn a livelihood to pay for the homes that we almost don't get to inhabit except after work. This is a crazy set of paradoxes. So instead of going elsewhere to always work for others, where we might end up doing destructive things that hurt the planet at the end of the day, what if we were to localize our strength, our character, and our talent to become so resilient that the streets would become safer? Because at the end of the day, you wouldn't just have fixed a roof, you would have built relationships and engendered stronger connections and had a stronger sense of identity and ownership. Well, we think retrofitting the American landscape with public squares is the tipping point. It's the way to really engage this, because it gives us something physical to do, and the rewards are instant. Okay, but to look at the current paradigm, a woman, a single mother here, lives in that black square, and she flies all over the city in her car during the course of the day, having a massive impact just to go get groceries, to buy some shoes, to pick up her child, go to the doctor, and to go to work. And at the end of the day, she comes home and maybe she hasn't even learned another person's name, even though she lives among thousands of people, millions of people, who are moving about in the same way, passing by each other, but having almost entirely perfunctory interactions, only about work, only about consumption. We're challenging this and we're saying it can be entirely different, and in the process of somehow addressing this paradox, we will save, or rather savor, the world. We should realize that whether we're in less dense or more dense neighborhoods, the public square is utterly absent, and by design. The National Land Ordinance of 1785 that mandated the Roman colonial grid over the entire country was the first time in the history of colonial infrastructures in the world that public squares were not included in the plan. You go south of here, across the border, through all the lands down to almost to Antarctica, there are plazas and zocolos everywhere, and yet they live in a colonial grid, and that's because the Spanish said it's important to have such places. But for Americans, whoops, it was excluded. It was somehow omitted from the design. Less dense, more dense. They're all living in isolation and in this sort of paradoxical condition where they don't realize that they're surrounded by people who all feel the same. And then we end up living in this landscape of commodification, of product orientation, where houses no longer speak to the street and they don't help define and animate that space so that we would even realize that it's a commons. And then these containers where we go to visit the vital activities of the village are actually remote from our home, so we must drive to them, we must consume. And then at the end of the day, you're locked out. The village is closed to you. Did we ever volunteer for this? Did we ever say, hey, what fun, let's give up our authority to people we've never even met downtown and not have that vital village center where we even learn how to speak and sing? Never happened. Fortunately, there was a brilliant young woman at the beginning of the last century named Lizzie Maggie who invented the game Monopoly as a way of helping Americans to understand the National Land Ordinance. And you know how this game works because you've played it. You go around a couple of times. I hope you notice that the only form of commons is a jail and a parking lot. And then what's for sale are actually forms of commons. You're actually buying streets as if you can ever buy and sell a street. And then further, you're actually happy to be tearing down houses and putting in hotels, playing gentrification, as if that's fun. It's a terrible sort of trick. But this is a condensed version of the National Land Ordinance, and this is supposedly how the USA is supposed to be played. Incidentally, the National Land Ordinance was the first document that defined the character of the USA. The second was the Declaration of Independence, and the next two, of course, being the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But we never hear about the National Land Ordinance, and we should, because it proscribed how we would live. It proscribed our economy and our political structure, and the fact that as we moved westward and we took land from the native people, suddenly it would all become a commodity, and time and space in life would be for sale. This is big stuff. So instead, we're saying we can localize, we can shorten the distances we travel, we can appreciate each other so much and care enough about our reality that maybe we'll get off the freaking couch to save the world, but not just to save it, but to realize that we're part of a continuity that goes back all the way through time and forward as far as we can possibly have the courage to dream, if we get our act together. So we did that. We actually did it for the first time. We transformed a street intersection into a public square. We did it illegally. I'll show you images of that. City Council was really surprised that we would do such a thing, but then they saw that we had met all of these standing goals and objectives for every single neighborhood, and they unanimously legalized the transformation of street intersections for every neighborhood to do all across the city as many times as people would want for free. So I'll say more about that as we go. But this was the plan. The City Council asked us, well, my God, you're all getting along and traffic really is slowing? People seem to be interacting with each other, and the police say that they never get calls from that part of the neighborhood. What could be going on? I mean, where could this all be going? And we just put a bunch of stickers all over a map of the city, and we said, frankly, we have no idea. All we know is that people everywhere need to be able to, at last, recreate the public commons between their homes so that it reflects their character and their vision and brings them together at last so that they can meet the challenges of our time. And this was the idea. It was an utterly elegant, simple idea that the patterns of placemaking and participation that we go elsewhere to visit can reemerge here through our own creativity and initiative. And basically this presumes that we have power where we live. We're not always asking permission all the time. A friend of mine handed me this image about a decade ago, and I'm seeing it sort of travel all over the internet, but it comes with a story. These are young children in school in Western Africa. What's lovely about this form of school is you can't cut the budget. You can't say there's not enough money to pay for the roof of the books. They are the books. And the way this starts is every couple of weeks the kids come back together with a couple of mentors and they tell stories in circular fashion. Each story has to do with recognizing that circles and spheres and cycles are inherent to everything about our planet. And as they go around and around telling stories about sort of that insight, they build community, they become consummate storytellers, they become great listeners, and they all learn together what they all hold. And the overall point of it, is that they are the circle, that they are the village. It doesn't matter what it's made of, it's actually us that is the village. And then when you impart that, of course, you're probably going to end up with a sustainable society characterized by robustness, resilience, cultural expression, and so much more, and longevity. But what's it like to live in a culture where the tree of life isn't just a metaphor, that you actually understand the physical environment around you, the ecology, is a living, breathing organism of which you are an integral part? What if? What if you understood that the tree of life is so much more than a metaphor, that it actually extends through time and space and everything is interconnected? What if you lived within in a cosmology like that? What if you understood that everything is moving constantly and your very life force depends upon those actions? It would bring you to your knees in appreciation and humility, which is why we travel across the oceans, why our children do these cultural immersion projects through universities to just go spend time there. And then they come back here and try to figure out what in the world to do. It's been so very different. These sorts of symbols, this one happens to be Mayan, is saying that the village is where pathways converge. The center of the village is the piazza. In this case, it's symbolized by a piece of resin. The circle is talking about the 4 quarters of time, but also the perimeter of the village. It's a social thing, not just a geographic compass. It's a diagram of sustainability so that their entire culture can be saying time, space, and life is integral and not for sale. Okay, so we know a lot about this. We use the Cartesian grid. We know where north and south and west is. But at the same time, and actually the understanding goes really far back in our own tradition. There's a little bit of an Assyrian village diagram over there that's 5,000 years old on the lower right. So we've got some of these pieces, but frankly we've been so busy going around smashing things and attacking other people, as we've installed our very violently our colonial grid, that there's a lot that we have forgotten. We've forgotten this, that on the left, when you live in a voluntary landscape like this that's characterized by the wisdom of the grandmothers and grandfathers that are tuning the village like a great lira for hundreds or thousands of years, that it works. That the blocks are characterized by circularity with no lines drawn down the middle to say that people's interests are separate. It's a place that facilitates communication and cultural expression on a daily basis so powerfully that it doesn't even have to be planned, it just happens. And on the right, the ubiquitous grid all across the country, mandated with the stroke of a pen hundreds of years ago by people we've never even met, and yet we still live within these lines, and we don't realize that that open space that these people enjoy on the left has actually been mandated out of our lives on the right. No wonder we have the most intense experience of isolation in the world. A public square is extremely important. But after all, these are the places that we come from. This is where we like to go, linger and take time to refresh ourselves and fill our hearts before we come back again, to go back to work, to earn money, to then hopefully go away again, to vacate, so to speak. The places of our ancestors where living and working was integral. Notice that there's actually a car going through here, through the street at the same time as there are people walking, and the driver's apparently saying to himself, well, I won't kill them. Because they're my village. I'm part of this place. Maybe I identify with them strongly enough. And meanwhile, the passeggiata of this Italian village is playing out as they watch like a great tide from one place to the next, as they do every single day of their lives. What a thing. Their crime rates are multiple times less. Their health statistics are through the roof compared to ours. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that their landscape isn't just walkable, it's talkable. Everywhere they intersect is a place to gather. The French apparently don't have a problem with this idea. Look at this sort of plan of a French village. There's widenings of the intersections all throughout the village fabric, minor and major spaces. They seem to be okay with the idea that they should speak with each other. What are we missing when we don't have such places? What we're missing is the cohering of our lives so that little girls want to grow up as women, sharing stories together, and eventually become old ladies that then rear their granddaughters in the same place of stories that they've always been a part of. And when they look into her eyes and they hear her sing the songs back to them that they taught her, they know somehow that things will be okay and the culture will persist. This applies, of course, to men as well. Such populations remain stable. Americans move every 4 to 7 years, always looking for some better place. And yet they probably are in a place that would be just fine if they fell in love with each other there. So Native Americans have been doing the same thing, gathering this is a Powhatan village on the left, gathering their habitations to define a common center. Here's more contemporary Sioux here in the plains, but still identifying with the circle and identifying the commons between them. This is a human pattern. It's human habitat 101 to remember, again, that when we even look each other in the eye without fear, that the village is alive between us and it doesn't really depend on what it's made of. Okay, but for Americans, what we get is a Christmas card. You know, like here's the village and the sacred tree of life in the center. Merry Christmas, you know, as an aspiration or perhaps a dream. But no, it doesn't have to be that way. We have installed more than 500 participatory gathering places in the city of Portland alone with the lowest budgets that you can imagine because people are suddenly getting excited, sharing ideas, really caring to listen to each other, and then taking these Walmart's worth of stuff in their basements and garages and closets and bring them out to build stuff with whatever they can, and suddenly their lives begin to change. But for Americans, seriously, I mean, is this as good as it gets? On Northeast Broadway Boulevard in Portland, Oregon, this is the only bench just for sitting between 0 Street at the Willamette River and 360th. And along the way, you see things like Stonehenge Apartments. You know, it's just an apartment, it's not Stonehenge, but they're connotating place. Or Village Square, which is really, after all, just a laundromat. It's almost like saying to a bird, you know, nest ahead. You're trying to coerce the nest into coming in to buy some seed, perhaps, but there's no freaking nest. All right, so here you are. Maybe you're a villager from another country. You walk along here and you come upon this bench and you think, well, I mean, there must be a meter. I'm in the USA. Surely I would be charged for sitting. You feel underneath the bench looking for the meter. It's like, oh my God, someone actually put in a bench just for sitting. Maybe there's hope, you know? So you'd sit down for a while, and as a villager from another country, you're used to sitting down because there's a view, you know? So you check out the hedge for a while, and then the parking lot, and then you decide to buy some luggage and get the hell out of there. You know, go somewhere else, where else may be more conducive to interaction. It is a rare thing. You know, though, that there are villages in the world where they make sure that there's at least 3 places for a grandmother to sit between where she lives and where she goes to get her groceries, and that's their building code. And they have songs to remind the children that that's the highest value of all. So unlike ourselves. Here's sort of an unfair comparison between 2 intersections. This is the Piazza del Campo. It's the intersection of the trade routes between Pisa, Milan, Rome, and Florence that meet in the Tuscan Hill sort of town that has become Siena. And I mean, you may have been there and seen this fabulous horse race that happens twice a year, but this is the best that an intersection can be, a place of convergence, because after all your pathways are coming together, you will tend to bump into each other. We know about that because that's where we run into each other in cars. Like, that's how powerful intersections are. You will run into each other one way or another. But on the right, is it just going to be a nullified space where you wait at the light, waiting to maybe get to go to a place? There are places in the world, like in Nepal, for instance, where as you wander the landscape, crossroads become a place of sacredness and temples where you come upon something because it is a convergence point, and they know that. We, on the other hand, are living in normative patterns and have forgotten so much that we'll get in the car at the start of the day and traverse the landscape to go to our job and come home at the end of the day exhausted, and at the same time filled with anxiety that just by going to work to earn money to pay for our lives, that we're contributing to the rising of the oceans and of the temperatures on the planet. This is a function of the most ill-considered design priorities imaginable that have played out in North America, where actually the Hoover administration worked with General Motors. I mean, you know pieces of these stories too, where they actually engendered a landscape of increased consumption in order to accelerate the economy, in order to dominate other countries in the world. and at the same time understood that they would be isolating people and forcing them to consume more. All right, so here we are. And this is Portland, Oregon. The grid landed as hard on us as everywhere else, but this town has changed, like you've probably heard, like nowhere else. In fact, citizen participation is through the roof in this city, whereas in all other American cities, it's actually in decline. So it's time for this my favorite metaphor, which is the revolt of the pawns. You know how this game is played? Sort of traditionally, old-fashioned chess has to do with, dividing people up by their superficial differences. It's the game of kings, so the kings always survive. At the end of the game, you're like, oh, don't kill the king, you can't take the king, and of course it's the king's game. So new chess starts off by saying, well, the pawns, after all, are the working class, and they all have names and talents and skills and families. And somewhere in there would be a community organizer, wouldn't there? So during the night, before the next game starts, the community organizer pawns come out to the center and they exchange stories, and they're starting off by apologizing. They're like, I'm so sorry for what happened in that last game. We came out and we attacked you, and you attacked us, and we killed each other. The tall, oppressive ones with the funny hats behind us were telling us what to do. So they decide to change sides there, and it's basically the 60s and the 70s here, agitating and sort of trying to help people wake up. And they're saying to the other pawns, you guys are always talking about getting out of the box and thinking outside the box, you fools, don't you realize we're in boxes? And the pawns are saying, well, but this is our job, we can't question this, our lives depend on doing what we're told. Fortunately, they managed to get into small groups with facilitators. Sitting there talking about their oppressive childhoods and all the things that have been happening to them, and sharing stories and sort of waking up like, oh my God, you were going through this too, I had no idea, maybe we were isolated or something. They go to the back row to confront their oppressors who are totally defensive and in denial, and the pawns get pissed and kick them off the board. Every revolution kind of works like that. But instead of that, the last few decades have looked way more like this, where people are saying, I have something to share. People are saying, I have ideas. Other people want to help and support and contribute. And a little while later, it sort of looks like this. What we're saying in the work that we're doing, where suddenly, instead of using design as a way to simply make money and you don't care about what happens to the community, what we do in Portland is we use design, like we are design crazy culture, and this is why, because we use design as a means to build community. We bring people together around processes of culture building where whatever is created reflects them, and suddenly they love their place more, and then it accelerates and beautifies everything about what we do. So the chess pieces have just stood their ground. They've said, this is the place that we will love. They started to plant gardens. Apparently they've got 3 Asian pears and a squash going here. They've put in, they finally got some furniture, I think, on the table, but they've also planted some gardens, and they've got a couple of hot tubs here as well. I think that savoring the world is going to be much more about living our lives more fully in an aesthetic experience of being with each other, and not just feeling as if we have nothing in common, but finding way more than we ever knew to do with each other. So we've verified this. James Howard Kunstler, who's the author of The Geography of Nowhere, has said it's maybe too late for Americans because we can't, after all, speak or listen anymore. We don't seem to have the patience. It may be too late to build the gathering places that we so desperately need. So we thought, well, he might be right, but on the other hand, he probably hasn't talked to the people who have somehow come to believe that things are impossible. So we went to sit down with these second grade girls, and we just said, girls, can you think of any way that we might be able to slow traffic, get kids involved, make the streets safer, and address all these livability and sustainability goals? Because adults across the country, millions of them, seem to think that they'd have to live within the way that things are now, within the rules that constrain them. And this little girl on the right says, are you serious? You really can't figure those things out? So she said, all right, well, this little red circle here represents a pony ride. I guarantee you can get a bunch of ponies out on the street. Everyone's going to stop their cars, they're going to get out, they're going to want to pet those ponies, they're going to want to ride those ponies, and on one of the corners you can have a pool and some chairs and a snowman on another corner and a sandbox and a place for kids to play. What she's doing is actually starting to be, as a hardwired placemaker, she's doing what the greatest architects in the history of the world do, which is animate and define the edges of the open public commons where our pathways converge. This little girl on the upper left says, I have an even better idea. I know if we put an ice cream parlor right in the middle of the street, tables and chairs in all the corners, we can have family-sized skateboards so everyone can skate together, and a climbing arch, everyone's going to start talking and getting along, and like how effortlessly. They literally went on for hours and hours, like, wait, we have even more ideas. But we had to go home. But we knew something when we left. So this is what we've done in Portland. we realized it was an epiphany. 150 years we've been there without a single public nexus, a social space. So our process started out by defying the mayor, who said, I will not let you create a public square, because after all, then you'll gather, and then you'll have a revolution. And we thought, well, that's an awesome idea, actually. Hadn't thought of that. So we went downtown and we seized the 2-story rooftop of this parking garage, and we painted this fabulous graphic on the top of it. And he shows up in his little Mustang. He was off in the upper right corner yelling at people, saying, I have all the power in this town, you can't do this. And people are saying, keep painting, we'll throw him out of office as soon as possible, which is what we did. We replaced him with a guy that looks amazingly like Santa Claus, actually. But it became this thing. It became one of the most greatest public squares in the world, and it actually was as if this giant acupuncturist touched the body of our city on the perfect spot, because suddenly the entire region began to shift. We finally had a place that everyone could belong to, and it inspired us and affected our consciousness to the extent that we do now have the most bike commuters and the most bike lane miles by far, the most fabulous mass transit infrastructure, the most green buildings by far. So many different things are going right in this town because people are basically getting off the couch to say, we want the most farmers markets, more than 50 now across the city. Our artistic culture is so robust, I'm sure that it has surpassed the Renaissance, and I know that's a big statement, but we're not waiting around for the Medicis to fund what we do. And it's not specialists like Leonardo that are somehow leading the way. Everybody's doing this. It's a cultural impetus, it's an urge that's coming from all directions. We have the shortest distance between where food is grown and where it's consumed of all cities in North America. We've actually met and exceeded the Kyoto climate carbon reduction targets. 3 counties have agreed to hold the line and save forests and farmland and reinvest constantly in the inner city so that the city remains vital. Oops. Actually, my favorite thing is that every single year we set a new world record for the most naked bike riders in the streets, which is something around 25,000 people now. The big businesses downtown were saying to the mayor, you can't do this, my God, they're naked. And he's like, you know what, actually the hotels and restaurants are full. People are coming from everywhere, and it's not just thousands of naked people. The progressives and liberals are naked, they're the ones on the bikes, and then the conservatives are all along the routes taking pictures of them. It brings the whole community out, which is a good thing. Okay, so where this actually goes deeply into the community starts to look like this. 2 little girls got run over by a car, got mowed down just trying to get to a playground. It hadn't become an issue that this area of Portland with 500 houses landlocked by busy streets had nowhere for kids to play and no public square. So adults got together to talk about it. They invited the neighborhood historian who was always writing articles in the paper, and they said, Eileen, what's going on? And she said, we live in the Roman grid. You studied this in high school. It's called westward expansion and manifest destiny. We're out here to cut down trees and extract resources, and the original design was the proceeds basically go back to the East Coast. And things have changed since then, but we still live in this fabric of isolation. So we never meet these standing goals to help people talk, provide gathering places, make our places safer, certainly calm down traffic and beautify and inspire other people. So all these adults were talking about these issues, and somebody said, well, maybe we could repurpose some public space. Maybe a street could become a public square. His father said, that's impossible. We don't have the power. The mayor and the city council never come here. Fortunately, there was this 13-year-old young woman who said, wait, I've done a chart of what everyone does for a living around the space. If we were connected to each other, maybe we would care to do this. And everyone said, wow, there's a chef. Everyone likes to eat. There's a doctor. We all get sick. There's all these people who could be working together, and it became this sort of interconnected diagram over here on the right. Everyone became inspired because we realized we actually were a village, and this became the idea. We called transportation, they said, that's impossible, that's public space, so nobody can use it. And we said, well, doesn't that sound dystopic to you? What if what if our disempowerment is resulting in all these horrific things that are happening in our community? So we came up with this idea to create a public square that would just be a shock of beauty and color. And as we were talking about that, one of the mothers just said, I can't even take it anymore. Oh my God. And she runs down to the intersection and puts in what she called the world's first 24-hour chalk station. And when we came out of the meeting, there was already this village insurrection underway, but the sort of interactive participatory folly or feature that the girls were working with there. We built the world's first little free library, actually, it turns out, on the southeast corner. Then we did this. And the police came and they said, this is the coolest thing we have ever seen. We're not even going to report you. When transportation gets mad, we will stand with you. because this is so important to see. And then people in transportation started to fight and argue with each other and say, having common ground is essential for people. The people on the East Coast were saying, we grew up with the streets being a place to play, and on the West Coast they prohibit it, so there's polarity. The city council legalized this for everyone to do across the city. To dance in the streets, to wake up the next morning with more courage in our hearts. World's first 24-hour solar-powered self-service tea station here on the left. These kids all from separate families doing things that bring them together so that they actually identify with this place. You know what? People are always worried, what about all the vandalism? How do you take care of that? Actually, it never even happens. And the reason vandalism happens is because you're not doing this. Because there isn't a place where people kind of mentor their children to relate to the larger community. All these fabulous projects inspired and built by children and their families. And then you start realizing that there's this vast skill set of people and all their talents and visions. You know what has happened here? Nobody moves anymore. It's stabilized. The localized economy that would automatically start to emerge in such a condition has emerged, and people are actually employing each other, taking care of each other's children, mowing down fences to interconnect their homes in the middle of the block, surveying each other to see what interests they might have, tearing up yards and putting in vast gardens, modeling ideas for how the project grows in scale, and then growing it in scale on each corner. And then the effect goes into the blocks, renovating houses, tearing up more yards, making gardens. And the city comes along and surveys it and found that everyone feels safer and there's less crime. There's not any tax money used. It's basically people getting creative with each other and making lots of freaking friends, so that if there's even a fire in the neighborhood, it gets put out before the fire department is even called. There's lots and lots to say about this. And then they decide to change it and paint another design. And then to repaint it and paint another design. And then run around like crazy because they're so happy. And then do these sorts of things. Like, this is actually legal in the streets of Portland, Oregon. This is why you don't have vandalism. Because children come along and say, well, after all, wouldn't unassailable logic be that dinosaurs would be mad that we're burning their bodies as fossil fuel? Wouldn't they want to come out of the manhole cover and eat cars? And of course, wouldn't Superman want to help? Like, when you listen to kids and let them do this kind of thing, they don't lash out at the community because they identify with it. And then they do it again in a whole other design. And then they have birthday cakes where they're actually making the cake. They're like, we will have our cake and eat it too, while we freaking engender world peace and inspire all these other places. Okay, then we built this mobile tea house because we noticed that the major media hadn't announced that suddenly streets were available to everyone across the city to transform for free. So we made this mobile tea house that would serve free chai and chocolate cake everywhere it went. Looked like this, made out of an old broken down truck, but now we knew all the mechanics that we needed that were connected as friends. Went all over the city to parks and block parties, parking lots, wherever it was called, to help people connect to each other. So they're connecting with their neighbors, and then all around the city we connected all of those locations into something called Hands Around Portland, and we did it 3 times to basically bring people outside and say, this is our city. What is possible at that point? And we partied like mad. We filled the streets with people wearing animal costumes, because after all, it was Earth Day. And we've been doing that every day, every year since we first did that in the year 2000. Then it happens all over the city. And of course, in the Sunnyside neighborhood, they would use the sunflower, because that's the logo of the neighborhood. A lot of people in other parts of the city or in other cities look at this image and they're like, well, I don't want a sunflower. Well, you don't get one, actually. That's for the Sunnyside neighborhood to have. That's their idea. You need to have your own idea. You get to have your idea, not somebody else's idea. Like this, in the Overlook neighborhood, they've been building turbines and propellers and wheels for decades, and so they're celebrating that in the streets as a great way of bringing themselves together. The major flora and fauna of the Northwest region celebrated in the streets. This is, for some reason they needed a giant mariner's compass in the streets, and I'm not going to question them. This is their idea. This one's a memorial to 3 kids that were mowed down by gunfire at this location, so this is the community's creative response, actually quoting Buckminster Fuller in the process. Another one, all over the top. This one. The grandmother of the neighborhood, when she was 3 years old, she planted an oak tree on the corner just behind them. And when she died, at 103 years old, the day after she died, her great tree fell into the intersection and died. And since then, they have repainted this effigy of that tree, naming it after her ever since. Just ask yourself, how many stories vaporize in our community because they're not memorialized. The fabric of place is so weak in our communities, and it's utterly up to us to do something about it. But the piece that's missing the most are places of memory and story, what we call public art, and we have to go downtown to see. What if it happens in our community as an expression of our own stories? Another one. All these features are now free. All across public space in Portland, Oregon, you can install covered bike parking, solar-powered cob kiosks, which are pre-approved, community composting in the streets, benches and seats. So many other things are now free and available for people to undertake. This is an image of the cumulative impact as of 2 years ago in Portland, Oregon, of just the things that we've been involved with. The activity is dense all across the city. It's gone to other cities, such as Bay City on the coast, where the National Endowment of the Arts has been funding us to help people redesign their entire cities. It's gone to every major city on the continent, including this one in Los Angeles. I think this image right here says everything about what public space is for. They were running out of brushes, and the last brush was held by the son and the father as they painted the street together. And that is absolutely what public space is for. For thousands of years before cars existed, public space, the spaces between our homes, brought us together. And since the domination of cars, that much less do we even speak to each other. So this is what public space is for. It's for birthday parties, it's for celebrations, it's for projects, it's for workshops, and more than anything else, it's to symbolize our connection to each other. For everybody. Andy Singer came to Portland and he said, oh, I see. So before it was a place where people all felt like they were isolated and nobody else could understand, even though they were isolated too, and even the dogs were bummed out. And then he's like, after, this is what it can become, but actually put after on the left, because this was our timeless village truth of the village heart being the place from which everything came, long before the grid ever arrived in our lives. So it came before, and it probably is our long-term destiny to always have a place where we come together with each other. In the streets of Portland, people are marrying each other. Like, talk about traffic calming. Talk about making the streets safer. What if after this event, everybody in the whole neighborhood has danced together and know each other? What if they've stood together, in this case, this couple being married by a woman and a man, and somehow, they're being married by their own neighbors, and people are standing up reading poetry and prose and saying, we are villagers here together. I'll just close by talking about this white-haired man in the middle. He's the self-described most conservative man in the United States, former president of the Chamber of Commerce in Cincinnati. His wife, Lorraine, said, come on, Jim, it's our nephew's wedding. Dance with everybody in the street, because they were doing this great spiral dance in the street. And he said, no, I don't do that. But he did. He started to dance with everyone, and he started to move his body like his ancestors used to when he was part of the village. I watched him because this is my uncle, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. And at the end, he came up and he said, I realize we all have the same God, no matter what we call it. And that's what public space is for. So the last thing I'll say is I'll quote the great teacher Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright got on his knees praising Louis Sullivan. He's sort of the so-called father of modernism, and people say that he said things like form follows function, but he didn't mean that the American landscape should look like a bunch of vending machines. He was talking about love, and this is the best thing he ever said that I've read. It is the destiny of all people to create a fit, abiding place, a safe and beautiful world. So thank you.